The agenda this week examined if unpaid internships might be too high a price to pay, weighed the merits of a trade deal with Europe, and explored the supposed rift between Conservatives and members of Ford Nation. The Agenda's Week in Review begins by remembering. In our last 12-13 minutes here, I'd like to really spend a good chunk of that time then on George Santayana's ever-famous edict that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So let's find out what there is to be learned nearly 100 years later from the events that took place in the summer of 1914. Margaret Macmillan, get us started here. What are the enduring lessons that you feel need to be learned from this great conflict?
Well, I think there are lessons, but if I can start out by saying I've always thought that George Santayana thing is absolute rubbish. I'm not quite sure what it means. It's one of those things that sounds great and everyone repeats and says, oh yes, how very profound. Anyway, I think there are never clear lessons from history, and you can find any lessons you want in history. I mean, there are far too many lessons, and when people rummage through history, they can find lessons to justify doing whatever it is they want to do. But I do think history can offer some useful warnings, and it seems to me that what the summer of 1914 shows is partly the dangers of complacency, the fact that they had got through previous crises, that they didn't take it seriously till it was too late. I think there's also a failure of leadership, and this is something very difficult to avoid against, but I do think there was a real problem in the types of leadership you had in Europe in 1914. You had Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, who just didn't take the situation seriously until it was much too late, and then came up with a series of rather sort of feeble attempts to try and get people to sit down and talk to each other. I think you had in both Nicholas II and Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany two leaders who were not strong enough to stand up to their own military, who were pressured into a war which I don't think either of them really in their hearts wanted. And I think we should remember the role of accident, that sometimes ghastly events can come from very small causes. And an assassination in a small, obscure city in the Balkans can set off a train of events if you don't get people willing to sit down and talk. And I think where we should be looking now, if we want to try and avoid something like that happening again, is the present danger spots in the world. I think the Middle East remains a source of potential conflict because it tends to draw in outside powers. So does the South China Sea, where you get outside interests coming in and where you get nationalist passions being whipped up. And so I'm not sure I'm going to offer any very clear lessons, but goodness me, 1914 offers us lots of warnings.
I'm getting letters from George Santayana's family already who are completely outraged at your dismissive comments about his most famous line. What are we going to do about this? Nothing.
I don't know. No, and everyone knows the line, so he's won anyway. So.
Fair enough, fair enough. All right, let's not say then, John Ferris, lessons from history. I like the way Margaret Macmillan put that. Useful warnings. What useful warnings could we have learned 100 years ago that are still relevant for today?
Okay, bearing in mind that lots of useful warnings contradict each other, three things that come to my mind are this. One of the reasons why the Balkan crisis catches Europeans by surprise is they don't take the Balkans seriously. They regard Balkan leaders and peoples as being barbaric. They can't believe that the Balkans are actually going to have any influence on what occurs in Europe. And yet the fact is that with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Balkan states are actually able to make European states dance to their tune. And that can happen with small powers quite frequently. Second, circumstances when power is seen to be shifting significantly cause decision makers to behave in ways that are not necessarily normal. So in particular, in 1914, it's clear that both the Austrians and the Germans believe they see looming in the near future a deterioration of their position. And this is actually quite true of Austria. The Germans are overstating the problem. But there's no question that, in fact, German leaders believe that the things are going to get worse soon. And when the opportunity emerges in June, July of 1914 to do something about it, they decide that they're going to gamble on very high stakes indeed. The final thing, and it's one that is actually not contradicted by many other things. Crises happen frequently, and when they do, people's behavior changes. One of the dilemmas in crisis decision making is that you assume that everybody's going to go on behaving the way they do normally. In fact, the dilemma is that nobody, including you, are behaving normally. And yet if you start taking precise adventuristic gambles, what in effect you're doing is starting a process you can't control. And the irony is that Kaiser Wilhelm, having been the person who in fact authorizes the Germans to take the action of offering a blank check to Austria-Hungary, also toward the end of July 1914 is the German decision maker desperately trying to stop a war from happening. But at that stage he's irrelevant. He's lost control of events.
You got wounded at some point, didn't you?
Yeah.
What happened to you?
I got banged up with mortar.
A mortar?
Yeah.
So mortar exploded, and
Yeah.
where did it hit you?
In the knee, in the right knee.
Shrapnel?
Yeah.
Were you down for the count?
Oh yeah, I was up for the count. What happens is they blow a pretty good hole and they bleed a lot. And when you stand up like that, you'll get lightheaded, and you fall down again. You just pass out. And so once you're horizontal, then you come to again. And you what am I doing lying down? I got to stand up, so you stand up. And then your boot fills up with blood again. So you.
But they got you out.
Yeah. Oh, what they do is they have jeeps. They will pull out as many wounded as they can pull out as fast as they can. They can't stay up there because they're what they call thin skins. There's no armor on those at all.
Now tell me this, 25 years ago, you probably had lots of buddies that you went to Remembrance Day ceremonies with.
Yeah.
Today, how many?
We'll probably have 2, maybe 3.
You and a couple of other guys?
Yeah.
That's it?
Yeah. And it's very sad. It's affected me more than I thought it would. Because over the years you try and keep this together and you have some good stories to tell and you talk. And I like it, but then now I find out that people I never ever suspected would die have gone. And they've been right here being interviewed.
I want to ask you one last question. You know, when I was a kid, we didn't do much on Remembrance Day. And it was a shame that we didn't. Shame on us. But it seems to be these days we're doing more and we're doing better.
Yeah.
But what do you think? Are we doing an adequate amount to celebrate what our vets have done?
I think so. I think so. I think if you get too much, then you get another feeling. You know, not that again. It's like listening to Rob on the TV today. You know what I mean? You've heard it every day for weeks now. Mm-hmm. No, I think they're okay. I'm not sure. I never had much of a chance to talk to my father because I was too young and he was too busy.
Yeah.
He was trying to make that farm go and it just wouldn't go. You couldn't push it, you couldn't pull it, you know. And I wish as I said before, I wish I had more chance to talk with him and get more. I don't know. I think I would have joined the Army just the same. It wouldn't have stopped me. I don't like war. I don't like fighting. I don't like any of that stuff. But sometimes it has to be done, eh? And I think we did a reasonably good job. We started off with nothing. We had nothing at the beginning of the war. I don't think, you know, we didn't even have uniforms, nothing.
I would say, from my generation to yours, for what it's worth, I think you did more than a reasonably good job. You defeated the worst evil the world had ever known.
So we beat them. I mean,
that's pretty good.
Yeah, I always sort of, I can't clap myself on the back, but we beat them. You know, no matter how smart. And, they were good, better soldiers than we were, and they had better equipment, but we beat them. And you know, it's funny how that can happen, eh?
Indeed.
Yeah.
I want to say to the people watching us on television right now that Mr. Haddon and I have had a very long and wonderful conversation, some of which you've seen on television, but the whole conversation will be on the website, theagenda.tvo.org. We've got about an hour of this there. Pictures, medals, stories. It's so good of you to come in today and share your Remembrance Day with us. Thank you so much, Lieutenant Haddon.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I'm always willing to talk about the war.
It looks like through the negotiation of these other agreements with other entities besides the United States that the Canadian government and Canadian business are really trying hard to diversify our markets. and yet it still feels as if we just want to do business with the United States. They're right there. They're handy. We know them. Is this a strategy that in some respects is just not doing what perhaps political leaders want it to do because the states are just right there?
Yeah, and companies maximize profits, and it's real easy. They have these established relationships and so on. And you think about Mark Carney, remember that guy? Who made the point that we're just too focused on these lagging economies. So 86% of our exports go to the United States, Europe, and Japan. We need to diversify away. But it's really hard to work in a lot of markets. We do need to get out of these traditional markets, and Department of Foreign Affairs has an estimate. If Canada could increase its import share of the BRIC markets, so Brazil,
Russia,
India, China, by 1% over the next 30 years, that would add up to $290 billion of additional exports.
Okay, but Aaron's point is if you do that, that's all well and good coming this way, but the opposite will also be true, which is our trade imbalances with them could increase even further.
Yeah, but unfortunately, the data don't bear out Aaron's prediction. I mean, the idea is that if two countries get involved in a trade agreement, if the measure of success is the trade imbalance that you had going in, no one would ever sign a trade deal because there'd always be a winner and a loser if that was the measure. The fact of the matter is, trade cannot be thought of as a zero-sum game in the way that you're thinking. Trade has to be thought of as win-win, where there's mutual gains, and without being technical, there are the static gains from trade, there are the dynamic gains from trade, and when Canada engages in free trade with Europe or the TPP countries, both sides could win. Notwithstanding the comment made earlier, there are winners and losers within each country, and there must be mechanisms, but on net, this country benefits, that country benefits. It is not zero-sum, it is win-win.
So I'm not suggesting that trade is a zero-sum game, but we have had a huge shift in Canada's trade balance over the past decade. If you go back to the year 2000, we were running a trade surplus of about $60 billion with the rest of the world. That was being added to our economic growth. Now we're running a trade deficit of about $40 billion with the rest of the world. That's subtracting from our economic growth. Now there may be other benefits to trade in terms of consumer prices and competition and other things that you've talked about. But I mean, would you agree that that's a bad thing for Canada, that we've sunk into this deep trade deficit?
And I would argue that it's a problem in the corporate sector. And a recent survey came out around Canada's innovation gap. And Canadians, when you have a low exchange rate and Canadians are exporting a lot simply because the exchange rate is low, that you cannot devalue yourself towards prosperity. When the exchange rate is low, you export a lot, but you're exporting low value. And when the Canadian dollar has risen to parity, what is incumbent upon Canadian companies is to become more innovative, to do more R&D, more branding, and export. So when you look at the change in our trade over the last decade, manufacturers drop, commodities rise, and Canadian companies need to be more innovative. And I will argue that the CETA will help us do that.
But isn't one of the risks with the CETA that we're signing this deal at a time when the Canadian dollar is actually overvalued? We have to price our products at a very high price in the European market. Conversely, German manufacturers have this huge competitive advantage coming from the fact that their currency, the euro, has been depressed by all of this turmoil in Greece and other parts of the Eurozone. I mean, aren't we perhaps setting ourselves up for a much bigger trade deficit because of this imbalance in the exchange rate that's happening just as we're bringing in this free trade deal?
Not at all. Same argument was made during the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement when the Bank of Canada implemented zero inflation. The same argument was made that interest rates were driven up to drive up the exchange rate. And just look at the Canada-US experience.
Right. We devalued our currency in the years following that deal, and that's why we were able to export so much to the States. You're proposing we do the same thing with respect to Europe now?
I'm not proposing that at all. I'm arguing that the same argument was made in the lead up to the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. It wasn't borne out in the data. The right strategy is not to devalue the currency. The right strategy is to have a strong currency to force Canadian companies to compete.
Okay, I know you guys aren't going to agree on this. However, I think it's an empirical fact that, is that redundant to say that? I think it is a fact that when the free trade agreement was signed, our dollar went to 66 cents US. And that's one of the reasons why trade went through the roof. I mean, that's true, isn't it?
Absolutely, and if you look at an empirical study, which I could share with you, Aaron, and you look at why did the Canadian dollar fall by 30% in that period, and much of it was driven by high levels of Canadian debt, high levels of inflation, and drops in commodity prices. And in fact, if you look from 2002, when the Canadian dollar hit its low, to when it went to parity in 2007, the reverse. Our inflation was well under control, our fiscal balance was better than anyone else in the G7, and commodity prices were up. So they're unrelated to the trade agreement. They're other factors.
They might open the door to further opportunity and practical experience. They might also open the door to abuse and exploitative work practices. Either way, internships are facing a backlash in Canada and the United States. Joining us now to tell us why, in New York, New York, Ross Perlin. He's author of Intern Nation, How to Earn Nothing and Learn Little in the Brave New Economy. And Ross, I want to just actually quote, before I ask you my first question, from your book, thus: "Today, interns famously shuttle coffee in 1,000 newsrooms, congressional offices, and Hollywood studios, but they also deliver aid in Afghanistan, write newsletters for churches, build the human genome, sell lipstick, deliver the weather report on TV, and pick up trash. They are college students working part-time, recent graduates barely scraping by, 30-somethings changing careers, and increasingly just about any white-collar hopeful who can be hired on a temporary basis for cheap or for free." Okay, let's pick up from there. Any person of a certain age, Ross, would hear that and think, hey man, you got to pay your dues. This is more whining by young people. Tell people why they would be wrong to conclude that.
I definitely hear that line a lot, Steve. People are always saying, got to pay your dues, young people these days, and there's some element of it that's just, a normal generational phenomenon where there's a kind of a disconnect or a generation gap. But I think people don't quite understand, especially people who entered the job force, entered the labor market maybe 20, 30 years ago or even before that. I don't think they understand the nature of today's internship economy and the extent to which it has become essentially a barrier to entry. Internships are the kind of virtual gateway into the world of white-collar work. They're widespread across the public sector, the private sector, nonprofits, for-profits, small and medium-sized businesses, the largest corporations. They've gone global, all over the world. I mean, it's a phenomenon that in some ways got started in the U.S., and we can talk about that history a little later, but that is now found, in just about every developed economy and increasingly in developing economies as well. So I think, older people don't quite conceive of this internship explosion that's happened, especially over the last few decades, and the ways in which it really sort of determines who can break in. People now doing not just 1 or 2 internships, but routinely having to do 3, 4, or 5 of them, just in order to kind of get to a place where they might get an entry-level job. But indeed, entry-level jobs have become a kind of endangered species.
Well, let me follow up on something you just said a moment ago, where you called them a barrier to entry. Again, I would suspect that the previous generation would say, what do you mean a barrier to entry? This is your means of entry. Internships are the way to get the experience that you need to get that job. Why is that not the case?
The original concept of the internship was centered on training and recruitment. So when you saw the sort of early internship programs, usually run by big companies, they were hiring 60, 70, 80% of their interns. If you did pretty decently well, you could expect to get a full-time job at the end of your internship. That was quite normal, and still goes on to some extent in a kind of a select group of companies that really pride themselves on their programs. But increasingly, that's not the case. You get caught in a kind of an internship trap, as I've called it. Where, and this is combined with rising levels of tuition, record levels of student debt. We have, across the Western world, we have youth unemployment at some of the highest levels since that's been tracked. And so clearly, there's actually a correlation there, but it's a negative correlation. I mean, the more unpaid internships we have, the worse youth unemployment gets, in fact.
Okay. Ross, thank you for setting the table for the discussion that is to come. We have 4 other people here in the studio who want to participate in the discussion, so let us welcome Mike Moffat. Mike is assistant professor at the Ivy Business School at Western University. Jaina Patel, a former unpaid intern who works now in marketing. Kyle Iannuzzi, former unpaid intern who is now an event producer. and Oliver Sachkow, who is a fourth-year Carleton University journalism student, and in the interest of full disclosure, we say, a former intern here at the Agenda. Oliver, welcome back.
Hi.
Nice to have you guys all around this table in our studio. And of course, we remind everybody that Ross Perlin, the author of Intern Nation, stays with our discussion. He joins us on the line from New York, New York. Let's start with this. Oliver, I'm going to start with you. I know you the best here. How many internships have you done in your so-called career?
So I've done 4 internships.
How old are you?
I'm 21.
You've done 4 already and you're 21?
Yes. Yeah.
What kind of internships have you done?
So I've worked at a daily newspaper. I did 2 internships there.
Which one?
It's the Winnipeg Free Press.
Okay.
I worked at a local TV station in Ottawa, and then at this program, of course. So that totals 4 internships.
That's 4. Did everybody pay you?
One of the internships was paid. It was in Winnipeg, and that was after I did an unpaid internship with them before.
Why do you think you did so many? 4 sounds like a lot.
It does, but I'm in a competitive field. I'm in journalism, and the fact is there's little jobs, very few opportunities. So I kind of felt that if I ever wanted a career in journalism, I would have to do internships. And in fact, I want to continue doing internships because at the end, the more you have, the more experienced you are, and the more employable you are.
Mike, how typical is this experience?
It's quite typical. Now, this field is full of what Donald Rumsfeld would call known unknowns. I didn't think, nobody thought I'd mention Donald Rumsfeld on this show, but it's full of things we know we don't know. So Ross mentioned that he didn't know the data for Canada. That's not because Ross hasn't done his research. It's simply there is no data for Canada. But anecdotally, I've heard stories of people working, so 4 sounds like a lot. I've heard 5, 6, 7, particularly in areas such as media, and I don't mean to scare my colleague, but these are very common, and they're becoming more common over time. Again, this is more sort of anecdotal, but 10, 15 years ago, you didn't hear about people doing multiple ones of these, and now it seems to be more of the rule than the exception. Okay, let's get another experience here. Kyle, you ready to go?
How's it going?
Terrific, thank you. Yeah. How old are you?
I'm 28.
How many have you done?
I've done a half.
You did a half of an internship?
I left midway, yes.
Where was it at?
This was at an event planning company, local luxury wedding planner here in Toronto.
And do I infer from the fact that you left halfway through that it wasn't doing much for you?
It wasn't doing much for me.
What was the problem?
I engaged in a contract there that was supposed to be an event planning, shadowing, learning about luxury wedding planning, internship, and I ended up doing a lot of copywriting and PR work for the business. So about halfway through, I had some questions about where this internship was going, who was benefiting more from it. And so I had that conversation with the employer, and we decided to go separate ways.
What was the employer's reaction when you brought these issues up?
The employer's reaction was a typical reaction. It was something to the effect of whether there was a sense of entitlement here or not, all about paying dues, and that what I was doing was what I had bargained for.
It was an unpaid internship?
Correct.
You went in knowing that?
I had a contract that said I wouldn't be paid for 6 months.
So that was not a surprise?
It wasn't a surprise.
But as you started doing the work, you thought, I shouldn't be paid for this.
Yeah, I thought, somebody's making some money off of this. I'm rewriting, I'm updating a website, I'm writing business profiles, I'm writing business proposals. These are things that you generally do to earn some income.
Did you sue anybody over this?
I went to the Employment Standards Act of Ontario. I filed a claim for unpaid wages, and I was successful in that claim.
You got $1,000 out of it?
Just under that, yeah.
Huh. And did that feel like an appropriate resolution to the whole issue?
Well, I mean, I didn't go about this process for money. I didn't go about it to be vindicated from anything. I really went about it actually to appear on the agenda with Steve Paikin. But in all seriousness, I was looking for an opportunity to tell this story to more people. I was looking for an opportunity to advocate for a vulnerable demographic that's truly being exploited. And so the Employment Standards Act of Ontario definitely helped with that.
Gotcha. Well, here's the thing. People who open the door don't always get to be the first people to walk through it.
That is correct.
And you have taken a bold stand to, in your view, stick up for your rights, which you don't think were adequately respected by the company involved in your internship. But are you worried that future other prospective employers may, as a result, see you as a troublemaker and this will hurt you?
Of course. Very worried. very worried. The internship program I was in, there was about 80 or 90 unpaid interns, and stick it through, get your 450 hours, don't say anything, don't talk to your employer. You're doing that just for a reference, so you don't want to ruin even that one reference you've already put your hours to. Making the choice to go public was a huge decision I made, and it was not easy at all, but I realized that if every intern that experiences possibly not a positive experience and does not say a single word, and I felt as if that was possibly happening at my specific program, it's possible that it just goes on and does not get heard. And so someone's got to kind of say something. That's how I felt about it.
Well, I must say I've been covering politics for about 30 years, and never has there been a day like today. We want to play a couple of pieces of tape right now. The first is from the scrum that Rob Ford gave on his way into his office at City Hall, and then I'll set up the second one after that. First clip, roll tape.
Oh, and the last thing was Olivia Gondak. It says that I wanted to eat her Olivia Gondak. I've never said that in my life to her. I would never do that. I'm happily married. I've got more than enough to eat at home.
Incidentally, wearing a Toronto Argonaut sweater, and the Argonauts put out a statement later in the day saying they were very, very disappointed with the mayor's conduct and did not want to be associated with any of that. The mayor of Hamilton also today said that the traditional bet between the Tiger Cats in Hamilton, the Hamilton mayor and the Toronto mayor usually make a bet before a playoff game, of which there is this Sunday. The bet's off. There's no bet this year. The mayor said that on the way in. That was in a live scrum, carried live on television. And then a few hours later, he came out with an apology. Roll tape.
The revelations yesterday of cocaine, escorts, and prostitution has pushed me over the line. And I used unforgivable language. And again, I apologize. These allegations are 100% lies.
Okay, his wife was not in that shot, but she actually was there. She was present at the news conference where he offered that apology. Okay, Eric, this is your guy.
Nobody wants to hear their guy say anything of that sort on television. It makes for great headlines. It will get picked up by every TV station and every newspaper, and that's what they're going to focus on. But it has nothing to do with running the city. The actions of the councillors afterward, turning their backs to him when he spoke, is just so childish. The entire situation has become incredibly complicated, and I wouldn't point that finger exclusively at Rob Ford. There are a lot of parties to blame for what's going on. I'm not saying that
there's a lot of parties to blame.
There are quite a few parties to blame for what's going on as a whole.
Explain.
His mistakes are clear and they seem to be continuous. But how it has been handled by the media, how things have been handled by other councillors, no one is doing their job.
Well,
by turning away...
What don't you like?
Hey, you can't turn your back on someone who's speaking, who's attempting to function, and this is what happened after that scrum in council. You're just exacerbating the situation. Everything is just gotten out of control, and no one's doing anything to make it much better.
Chris, this is your guy.
It is, yes. And I am probably of the camp that says big deal. He's uncouth, he's unsophisticated. I get much more outraged when I see councillors trying to ban plastic bags or implementing a land transfer tax. That affects me, so that matters to me. If I see someone being ineloquent, being Rob Fordish, it makes good news for the chattering class. It makes a news cycle, but it's not a policy issue. It doesn't affect the way the city's run. It might affect the perception and make him a little less effective. I don't see it as big of a deal as the media probably is making it out to be.
Meredith, your view.
I thought it was horrible. I thought that it seemed like he had thought about that ahead of time, like he was thinking it was a pretty funny joke to say. And the point of the joke was to defend himself against these allegations in the recent police investigation. But the butt of the joke was his wife. And I think because I had just read some of the recent investigation, and there are a lot of instances reported there of sort of sexual harassment and other shady things with him and different women, to have him come out and defend himself at the expense of another woman in his life was sort of shocking to me in a way that defied just even the language that he used.
Your view?
So for me, this is the part where I strongly disagree with these two. And I hear this constantly over the media, and it just aggravates me. You know, it's the media, it's the media circus, it's not his policies. But let's be clear on this for a couple of reasons why. The first reason is when Rob Ford started showing up late to work, people were asking him, where is this guy? He's the leader of our city, he's not there showing up at work, he's not doing his job. Secondly, when he starts missing council meetings for his football, a sport that I love and a sport that I've coached, and giving that as a legitimate excuse, his whereabouts are not there to be found. So that's one aspect. This is a world-class city. We need to take pride in this city. We cannot allow a petty, small-minded councillor to ruin our city. And the second aspect is this aspect of, oh, Toronto's in the news. You know, I was in Michigan last week. I went to get some milk at 8 a.m. It's CNN and Rob Ford's on, and all the convenience store owners are just kind of laughing at this.
What'd you think of that?
It's tough to hear. You know, I'm very patriotic. I'm very strong. I'm very proud to be Canadian. I'm very strong about being from Toronto, but it's really tough to look at. And there is a psychological concept. It's called organizational identification. When you see the profile of something lower and it becomes loses meaning, loses purpose, people don't want to associate that with anymore. And Rob Ford has a lot of good ideas.
Eric, I need to ask you this. What would Rob Ford have to do that he hasn't already done? And I add this caveat that all of what we have heard about him are in police reports that have yet to be proved in a court of law. But what would he have to do to run the risk of losing your support?
It's not what he has to do. It's what someone else has to do. Someone else has to stand up and say, hey, I'm with this guy on policy. I believe in what he stands for, but I will give you this type of leadership without the shenanigans, without the insanity.
Anybody else doing that?
No, and that is a
really no.
None that has come to the attention of many people. You know, John Tory, his name comes up quite a bit, but for some reason, he just has a habit of losing. He seems like a perfect player on the Leafs. He's got all the talent, he just can't win.
Well, hang on. Just for argument's sake. He did win the Ontario Progressive Conservative leadership. He then won a by-election afterwards to get into the legislature. Now, it's true, he lost the next couple of things.
Right.
So he's 2-2.
He's a reasonable candidate. There just aren't all that many. A lot of people now that I've spoken to, his name does come up all the time. There's a lot of head shaking going on. He's great on the radio.
Chris? What would Rob Ford have to do that he hasn't already done that would make you say, okay, that's too much, I can't support him anymore?
I'd echo Eric's comments. He'd have to just be worse than another candidate. And not just in terms of policy and seriousness and gravitas, but also in terms of his ability to actually win an election. So I'm a Rob Ford guy to the extent that he is the Conservative frontrunner. If it's Rob Ford or Olivia Chow, I'll vote for Rob Ford. If it's Rob Ford or a more serious Conservative candidate, again, with big, bold ideas and some sort of actionable plan to put them through, I'll definitely shift my support.
And that is our Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety. They're all on our website, theagenda.tvo.org, or on our iTunes channel, or on the YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.